Hello, welcome to this History Around Us Helmsley Castle video. This video is going to focus on an exam walkthrough, focusing on the idea about what the site can reveal about people's lives, and also focus on the idea of diversity as well. And just a reminder, Helmsley Castle questions are set on the following criteria, and this video really focuses on criteria E, the diversity of activities and people associated with the site, and criteria K, what the site reveals about everyday life, attitudes and values in particular periods of history. So just a reminder for the Helmsley Castle exam, you'll complete two 20-mark exam questions from a choice of 3. You have 1 hour and each question carries an additional 5 SPAG marks, which means that the exam is actually at 50 marks altogether. Okay, now there are certain times when a question will ask you specifically to choose a time period. So look out for this one. You must choose your time period, and the only advice the exam board give on this is that your time period must make sense. So ones that make sense for Helmsley Castle would be things like the time of what we respect, the De Roos family, and you go for the whole era for that, the 13th century, the 14th century, Tudor times, the era of the English Civil War. You could even go sort of 1700 to 1900, although I think that's trickier to do, or the modern era, but again I think that's trickier to do. So they're the time periods I would go for. Make it really clear which time period you've chosen in your brief introduction at the start of the essay, saying something like, the site I've chosen to study is Helmsley Castle, and the time period I've chosen for this essay is the era of the English Civil War. There's a bit of a timeline at the bottom there. Remember, the site is first built during the time period of Walter Respect in 1120, so you're not looking at writing anything in Helmsley Castle before 1120, even though we talked a little bit of contextual knowledge about Helmsley and the Norman Conquest when we taught it to you. Okay, now this is how to answer the Helmsley Castle questions. So decode the question, plan out your answer with 3 explanations. You need sort of developed explanation, a single line introduction that clarifies the question and identifies the time period. You don't really need an introduction if you've not got a time period question. Sustained explanations need to be linked to sort of second order concepts and site evidence. Link back to the question at the end of each paragraph. A clinching argument if you have time, but it's not central for Helmsley Castle, and it's 30 minutes for each question. And remember, 5 marks for SPAG, so don't make those silly literacy errors. If you just describe the site or make general assertions, that's level 1 to 4 marks. A basic explanation is level 2, 5 to 8 marks. Level 3 is 1 developed explanation, making sure that you including knowledge, analysis, and site and source evidence. Level 4 is 2 sustained explanations, and level 5 is 3 or more sustained explanations or developed explanations. Okay then, so we're just going to have a look at this question. It says, choose one period in your site's history. Explain what a study of your site reveals about the lives of different types of people at that time. Use physical features of the site as well as your knowledge to support your answer. So this question really requires you to choose one time period in your site's history, and I'm going to give you some pretty clear advice on which time period to go for. And you also need to think, it says here about the lives of different types of people at that time. So you can't just look at one group of people, you need to look at 2, maybe 3 different groups of people within your answer. And obviously, as usual with History Around Us questions, you have to use physical site evidence in your answer. So as you see the site today, what does that site tell you about how people lived their lives in the past? Okay, so in terms of decoding this question, you need to specify the time period. Once chosen, you have to stick to this time period. You don't get any credit for writing about other time periods. You need to think about what a study of the site reveals about the lives of different types of people. This focuses on diversity, so you need to be able to write about different types of people. Include specific and relevant knowledge. You must refer to site evidence. Only part of your GCSE where SPAG is assessed, so don't make those silly literacy errors. And it's all about diversity, so it's the similarities and differences in people's lives. Okay, now I would suggest that you, if you get a question about a time period 1 and you're looking at a time period to really write about the different lives of people, I would go for the 14th century. And the reason why I would do that is that there's a fantastic artistic interpretation here of the Great Hall, and it does so much to help you remember diversity at Helmsley Castle in the 14th century. So here in this artistic interpretation, you can see the lords of Helmsley, you can see local people enjoying a feast, and you can also see servants and workers in the castle as well. So straight away you've got that diversity. You can see at the end of the artistic interpretation the De Roos family on the dais, which is a raised platform. You can see there's a special door to the West Tower, which is their own private entrance into the Great Hall. The end of the Great Hall where the De Roos family is sitting is known as the high end of the Great Hall. And then the bit furthest away from the De Roos family, which is nearest to the kitchens at Helmsley Castle, is what's called the low end of the Great Hall. And of course you can see some servants that are bringing in plates of food, for example, on big dishes, which are known as chargers. We actually have some site evidence of those chargers actually in the museum today. Fragments of those chargers have been found at the site. So again, another nice little bit of site evidence for you there as well. So have that artistic interpretation in your mind. It portrays the Great Hall in the 14th century. So it's a really, really great one for diversity. Okay, so what you want to do for this question, choose a time period. I'm saying 14th century. You could do this one on the English Civil War. That would be okay, but the 14th century is a great time period to choose for diversity. And incidentally, you can kind of use some of this similar information to do an artistic interpretation question as well, if you get a question about an artistic interpretation. So the structure for this question, paragraph 1, I'd talk about what the site reveals about the De Roos family in the 14th century. Paragraph 2, I'd talk about what the site reveals about the constable in the 14th century. And paragraph 3, what the site reveals about the servants and the workers in the 14th century at Helmsley Castle. Any question about diversity must include at least 2 different types of people in your answer, but preferably 3 is better. Okay, so your introduction will simply look something like this. I've studied Helmsley Castle and the time period I've chosen is Helmsley Castle in the 14th century. That's it. But it goes without saying that you have to stay in that time period. So if you drift off and decide, oh, I'd like to write a time period about Jordan Crossland in the English Civil War, you won't get any credit for that. You'll just get no marks for that element of your answer. Okay, so let's have a look at an example answer for this. So key argument 1 is all about the De Roos family in the 14th century, and we need to think about what the site evidence can tell us about the lives of the De Roos family. So here goes the answer. Helmsley Castle reveals a lot about the lives of the De Roos family in the 14th century. Firstly, the heightening of the East Tower shows that the De Roos family wanted to use Helmsley Castle to project their power as the lords of Helmsley. Site evidence reveals this, as I can see today, the different coloured stone, which shows how the East Tower was heightened. Furthermore, in 1334, King Edward III visited Helmsley Castle. The fact that the distinctive ear turrets, which can still be seen today as site evidence, are similar to the Beauchamp Tower at the Tower of London, reveals the royal connections the De Roos family had and how important they were. This is also exemplified in the Great Hall. Site evidence remains of a raised platform called a dais, where the De Roos family would sit at the high end of the Great Hall during feasts. In addition, we can see the footings of a doorway that acts as a private entrance for the De Roos family to enter the Great Hall, probably in a ceremonial way from their private residence in the West Tower. Therefore, the site reveals the wealth and power of the De Roos family. So I think that's a developed explanation. You're talking, making some conclusions about what the site shows about the power of the De Roos family. Lots and lots of evidence there, lots of great knowledge, and using things like the Great Hall, for example, the footings of the doorway, the East Tower being heightened, the different coloured stone. It's all great use of site evidence. So this answer would now be up to level 3, probably about 11 or 12 out of 20. So let's have a look at key argument 2. Now, the great advantage of talking about the 14th century for diversity is you can write about the constable, and we can write about the extension of the South Barbican, so another major change at Helmsley Castle in the 14th century. So you start off your answer. Let's just read it about the constable. However, it was not only the De Roos family at Helmsley Castle. As a medieval castle, Helmsley Castle had many people involved in the military and security side of the castle. In charge was the constable. In the 14th century, the South Barbican was extended from being an open-backed barbican in the 13th century to create an accommodation for the constable. Site evidence of a fireplace, footings of rooms and of a latrine reveal this new accommodation and that the constable lived in comfort. A large window is placed above the South Barbican, reflecting this expansion. The constable's role was overseeing security at the castle, which is why he lived at the entrance. Source evidence reveals that the constable earned 3 pence a day. In 1338, King Edward III ordered William de Roos and the constable, William Starr, to look after a prisoner called Joan Fletcher within the castle. In addition, we know that the constable would have overseen the porter and the watchman who helped him keep the castle secure. This all reveals that the castle houses those in charge of the security of the castle, and that this was an important role and they lived in some comfort. Okay, so now we've been able to write about two groups of people. The final group we're going to write about for our third argument and take us up to a level 5 answer is the servants. So finally, a study of the site reveals the life of servants who worked to serve the De Roos family. A study of the site evidence of the Great Hall reveals there would have been a high end where the De Roos family sat and a low end where poorer people and servants would have eaten. Behind the entrance to the low end there was a screened passage which would have shielded those in the Great Hall from seeing the service rooms. A study of the site reveals the close location of these service rooms, such as the pantry, buttery and kitchens. Within this part of the castle would have worked the household steward, butlers, cooks and servants, who were all involved in preparing and serving the great feast. These people worked hard and did not enjoy the same wealthy standard of living as the De Roos family. So there's a great element of diversity there, that comparison in their lives, which is nice. Whilst the De Roos family enjoyed their own private chambers in the West Tower, the servants slept on straw in the Great Hall, as was common in medieval castles. This shows that others living in the castle did not enjoy a wealthy standard of living, but instead enjoyed a life of hard work. So there you have it. That's how you answer a question about diversity. You could also write an argument here about how Helmsley Castle served people within Helmsley itself, provided employment for people. You could talk about how, the Lords of Helmsley owned, the surrounding sort of farmland. They owned the mills, for example. They owned the oven where people had to pay to bake their bread. And the other thing you could have talked about is the religious life of the castle as well. And you could use the chapel to talk about that. You could also write about, hunting, for example, at the castle as well, and about how everyone enjoyed hunting. And you can bring that back into the idea of the Great Hall as well. So there's lots and lots of different elements that you can talk about, but the 14th century probably, you think about, this is the time period where there's the most people living at the castle, right? So obviously that really shows you that's a great time period to focus on in any question about diversity, basically. Okay, so 3 takeaways: decode the question carefully, cite evidence is absolutely crucial, and for questions about diversity, make sure you're able to write about different groups of people. For Helmsley, the 14th century is a great time period to focus on for diversity.